What happens when an inheritance becomes a death sentence? When sudden wealth transforms from blessing to curse so absolute that it leaves behind not celebration, but corpses? When one child's fortune triggers a cascade of deaths so methodical, so inevitable, that investigators would spend decades asking a single, haunting question: was it protection or elimination? Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing cases of familial destruction in American legal history. But before we descend into the twisted branches of this family tree, I need you to ask yourself something. If you suddenly became the sole heir to a massive fortune, who around you would celebrate your good luck, and who, if you're honest, might see you as an obstacle to their own survival? Tell us where you're watching from right now, and whether you believe family bonds are stronger than greed, because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about inheritance, desperation, and the corrosive power of money to transform love into something monstrous. This episode contains detailed discussions of death, violence, and suffering involving real events. We present this account with profound respect for those who died and those left behind. This is not entertainment. This is testimony. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. In the probate records of Cook County, Illinois, there exists a file that has been requested by researchers more than any other document in the archive's history. It's a will dated March 14, 1897, perfectly legal, properly witnessed, crystal clear in its intentions. But attached to this will, paper clipped with rust now bleeding into the yellowed pages, is a list, 23 names, every single one of them dead within 6 years of the will's execution. The youngest was 11 years old. The oldest, 73, different causes, different locations, different circumstances, all connected to one child who inherited everything. We're about to delve into a mystery that destroyed one of Chicago's most prominent families, where a young orphan's sudden wealth triggered a pattern of death so statistically impossible that modern actuaries still use this case in probability courses not to explain what happened, but to demonstrate how unlikely it was that these deaths were accidents. This isn't just a story about inheritance. This is a question about how money reveals the true nature of everyone around you, how desperation can transform ordinary people into calculating predators, and how sometimes the real curse isn't poverty. It's wealth that comes too suddenly to the wrong person at precisely the wrong time. This is the account of Eleanor Ashworth, the orphan who inherited a fortune, and the 23 people who died trying to take it from her. It was the year 1896. America was transitioning from the Gilded Age into a new century, though the gap between rich and poor had never been wider. The panic of 1893 still rippled through the economy like aftershocks from an earthquake, leaving devastation in every sector. Unemployment plagued the nation. Desperation hung in the air like smoke. And in Chicago, that roaring, industrial behemoth on the edge of Lake Michigan, where meatpacking fortunes were made in blood and the wealthy built marble monuments to their own prosperity, one family stood at the pinnacle of society, completely unaware that their entire lineage was about to be reduced to a single survivor. The Ashworth family tree, if you could see it laid out before you, would strike you as unremarkable for wealthy families of that era. A tangled network of marriages, births, business partnerships, and carefully arranged alliances designed to keep money concentrated in the right hands. At its root sat Augustus Ashworth, patriarch, self-made shipping magnate, a man who had transformed a single lumber transport boat into a fleet of 43 vessels that dominated Great Lakes commerce. By 1896, at 71 years old, Augustus had accumulated a fortune estimated at $14 million, roughly 400 million in modern currency. But money, as Augustus understood better than most, was worthless without succession, without heirs who would preserve the empire, without someone to carry the name forward. This is where the tree becomes interesting. This is where the wrongness begins. Augustus had married twice. His first wife, Caroline, bore him 3 sons, Richard, Thomas, and William. All survived to adulthood, all married well, all produced children of their own. A collection of grandchildren who surrounded Augustus like planets orbiting a sun, warming themselves in his wealth, positioning themselves for the moment when his light would finally extinguish, and his fortune would cascade down through the generations according to the natural order of things. But Caroline died in 1870, 9 of tuberculosis, leaving Augustus widowed at 54. And here, at this junction in the family timeline, Augustus made a decision that would puzzle society columnists, enrage his sons, and ultimately sign the death warrants of nearly 24 people. He married his housemaid. Her name was Margaret O'Sullivan. She was 23 years old, younger than Augustus's youngest son. She was Irish Catholic in a family of Protestant Americans. She was poor in a world of inherited wealth. She was, by every social calculation of the era, completely unsuitable. The marriage caused a scandal that rippled through Chicago society like a stone through glass. Augustus's sons refused to attend the wedding. His business partners questioned his judgment. The social pages dripped with barely concealed contempt. But Augustus, who had built his fortune by ignoring convention when it suited him, didn't care. Margaret gave him something Caroline's respectable bloodline never had, a daughter. Eleanor Ashworth was born on June 7, 1885. By all accounts, she was a quiet child, thoughtful, with her mother's dark hair and her father's analytical gray eyes. She did not attend the parties where her nephews and nieces displayed themselves like merchandise. She did not learn the elaborate social dances of Chicago's elite. Instead, she spent her days in Augustus's study, sitting on the floor while he worked, absorbing his lessons about shipping routes, profit margins, the psychology of negotiation. She has a mind like a steel trap. Augustus told his attorney, Jonathan Blackwell, during a meeting in 1896, "She understands the business better at 11 years old than my sons understood at 30. This observation would prove fatal to nearly everyone who heard it." Margaret died on February 19, 1897. Pneumonia, the death certificate stated. She was 39 years old. Eleanor was 11. And suddenly, this quiet girl with her books and her father's undivided attention found herself alone in a mansion populated by people who considered her an interloper, an obstacle, a mistake. Augustus, devastated by his second wife's death, withdrew into his study. He stopped attending board meetings. He ignored dinner invitations. He saw almost no one except his attorney and his daughter. The shipping empire ran on momentum and the competence of managers he'd hired decades ago. The family circled at a distance, waiting, calculating, their resentment of Margaret now transferred to her orphaned child. They waited for Augustus to come to his senses, to remember his real family, to restore the natural order. Instead, on March 14, 1897, Augustus summoned Jonathan Blackwell to his study and dictated a new will. The document was 17 pages long. Blackwell's handwriting, precise, legal, absolutely clear in its intentions, filled every line with instructions so detailed that they anticipated every possible challenge, every conceivable loophole. The witnesses were impeccable: a judge, a banker, a minister. No one could question its validity. The essential clause required only 3 sentences. I leave the entirety of my estate, including all business holdings, properties, investments, and liquid assets, to my daughter, Eleanor Margaret Ashworth, to be held in trust until her 21st birthday, at which time she shall assume complete control. My sons Richard, Thomas, and William shall each receive a one-time payment of $50,000 as their complete inheritance. All other relatives receive no bequest. $50,000. To men who had spent their entire lives assuming they would divide 14 million. To sons who had built their own mansions, accumulated their own debts, married women with expensive tastes, all on the assumption that daddy's fortune would eventually save them from their own financial recklessness. The will represented more than disinheritance. It represented annihilation of everything they'd planned, everything they'd assumed, everything they believed they deserved by right of birth. But here's what makes this interesting. Augustus didn't die. Not then. He lived for another 7 months, during which he seemed to rally. He returned to board meetings. He reviewed shipping contracts. He began teaching Eleanor directly, bringing her to his office, introducing her to captains and accountants, preparing her methodically for the role she would someday assume. She's a child. His son Richard protested during a family dinner in May of 1897, one of the few times the family gathered together after the new will became known. She's 11 years old, father. She can't possibly manage. She'll learn. Augustus interrupted, his voice cold. The way I learned, through experience and necessity. She has something none of you ever developed. She listens. The silence that followed that statement felt, according to a servant who was present, like the quiet before a storm. The kind of quiet where everyone's holding their breath, where the air gets heavy, where you know something's about to break. 3 weeks later, Augustus died. The official cause of death was heart failure. He was 73 years old, working late in his study, found the next morning by a housemaid slumped over his desk, his hand still holding a pen, a half-finished letter to a shipping partner in Cleveland describing his plans for fleet expansion in the coming year. The family physician, Dr. Howard Mills, examined the body and signed the death certificate without hesitation. Natural causes, expected for a man of his age and stress level. No autopsy was ordered. No questions were raised. Eleanor became, overnight, one of the wealthiest children in America, and the deaths began. The first to die was Richard Ashworth, Augustus's eldest son, Eleanor's half-brother. He was 51 years old, father of 4, husband to Catherine, a woman whose spending habits had required Richard to borrow heavily against his expectation of inheritance. Richard died on November 3, 1897, exactly 4 months and 12 days after his father's death. The circumstances were tragic, unquestionable, a terrible accident that no one could have predicted. Richard had been riding his horse through Lincoln Park, a daily habit, something he'd done thousands of times. The horse, a thoroughbred named Apollo that Richard had owned for 6 years, gentle as a lamb according to the stable master, suddenly reared up without provocation, threw Richard, and trampled him. The injuries were catastrophic: a fractured skull, broken ribs that punctured both lungs, internal bleeding that left him unconscious at the scene. He died before reaching the hospital. The horse just went mad, testified Marcus Fleming, a witness who'd been walking nearby. Just absolutely mad, like something spooked it, but there was nothing there, nothing. Just suddenly rearing and screaming, and I've never seen an animal act like that. The horse was examined by a veterinarian. No injury, no obvious cause for the behavior. Apollo was sold to another family and lived another 12 years without incident. Richard's funeral drew hundreds. Eleanor attended, dressed in black, holding the hand of her guardian, Jonathan Blackwell, the attorney who now controlled her trust. She was 12 years old. She didn't cry. Multiple witnesses remembered this detail. She stood at the grave site, perfectly still, her face composed, and when it was over, she simply turned and walked away. Cold, Catherine Ashworth told her sister that evening, "That child is cold." She showed more emotion at a theater performance than at her own brother's funeral. Catherine Ashworth died 16 days later. Influenza, the doctor said. It had been spreading through Chicago that autumn, a particularly virulent strain that hit the wealthy neighborhoods as hard as the tenements. Catherine fell ill on November 15th. By November 19th, she was dead, 47 years old. Mother of 4 children who were now orphans, their inheritance from their grandfather barely enough to maintain the household their mother had established. The funeral was smaller, more intimate. Eleanor attended this one too, again holding Blackwell's hand, again silent, again dry-eyed. "Someone should take that child aside," whispered Elizabeth Thornton, Catherine's sister, to her husband during the reception. "Someone should explain to her that people expect grief, expect some display of feeling. She's going to alienate everyone who might otherwise protect her." But Eleanor didn't need protection. She had Jonathan Blackwell, who controlled $14 million on her behalf. She had the law, which was absolutely clear about her rights. She had Augustus's will, which couldn't be broken despite 2 legal challenges mounted by Richard's widow before her own death. What Eleanor didn't have, increasingly, was family, because they kept dying. Thomas Ashworth, Augustus's second son, died on January 7, 1898. 50 years old, apparent heart attack while sleeping. His wife discovered him in the morning, cold beside her, his face peaceful. Dr. Mills signed the death certificate. Natural causes. Thomas had been overweight, sedentary, a heavy drinker. Heart disease was almost expected. His widow, Josephine, survived him by 3 months. She died in April of blood poisoning from a minor cut that became infected. The infection spread with unusual speed, according to Dr. Mills, who treated her in her final days. Sometimes the body simply surrenders, he told Josephine's daughters. Sometimes there's no medical explanation for why one person fights off infection and another succumbs. It's in God's hands. Josephine was 48. She left 3 daughters, all now adult women, all now watching their inheritances evaporate as their parents died, and Eleanor's fortune remained untouchable in its trust. William Ashworth, the youngest of Augustus's sons, was 46 years old when his older brothers died. He had always been the cautious one, the deliberate one, the son who'd watched his father build an empire and understood that wealth required both accumulation and protection. William had married a woman named Harriet Blackmore, daughter of a federal judge, a connection that gave him legal sophistication his brothers lacked. When the deaths began multiplying, when the pattern started becoming visible, William did something none of the others had thought to do. He hired a private detective. The man's name was Samuel Garrett, a former Pinkerton agent who'd established his own investigative firm in 1895. Garrett was thorough, skeptical, and expensive, exactly what William needed. "I want you to investigate every death in my family since my father's passing," William told Garrett in May of 1898, in Garrett's office on State Street, the door closed, the windows latched. "I want to know if there's a connection. I want to know if we're being targeted." "By whom?" Garrett asked, notebook already open. William hesitated, then, quietly, "My half, sister, or whoever controls her trust." Garrett spent 3 months investigating. He interviewed servants, examined medical records, reviewed financial documents, questioned witnesses, analyzed Augustus's will for any legal mechanism that might incentivize these deaths. He found nothing, nothing. William repeated when Garrett delivered his report in August. How can there be nothing? 6 people dead in 1 year. 7, Garrett corrected, consulting his notes. You forgot about Margaret Sullivan, who, your stepmother's sister, died in March, carriage accident in Boston. She was named in several family letters as someone who might challenge Eleanor's guardianship arrangement. The silence in Garrett's office felt thick, heavy, wrong. What are you saying? William whispered. I'm saying the deaths are statistically unusual, but individually explainable. I'm saying I found no evidence of foul play in any case. I'm saying your family has experienced terrible luck, Mr. Ashworth, but luck is not a crime. But, however, Garrett continued, I'm also saying that if these deaths were not natural, whoever is orchestrating them is extraordinarily careful, professional, patient. They're using methods that leave no forensic evidence, that appear completely natural to attending physicians, that would never trigger police investigation. Is that possible? Garrett closed his notebook. There are poisons that mimic heart failure, infections that can be introduced deliberately, accidents that can be engineered. If someone wanted to eliminate your family without detection, and if they had sufficient resources and time and access. He trailed off. Then what do I do? William demanded. You protect yourself, Mr. Ashworth. You vary your routines. You're careful about what you eat and drink. You trust no one who has anything to gain from your death. William followed this advice meticulously. He hired bodyguards. He changed his daily patterns. He had his food prepared by rotating cooks, each hired only for a single day. He became paranoid, isolated, a prisoner of his own wealth and fear. He died anyway, October 29, 1898. A fire broke out in his study at 3 o'clock in the morning. William was trapped on the 2nd floor. The smoke inhalation killed him before the flames reached him. His wife Harriet and their 2 children escaped through a 2nd floor window by climbing down a rope ladder, a safety measure William had installed specifically because he feared being trapped. But William's bedroom door, investigators discovered, had been locked from the outside. This was the first death that triggered police involvement. Detective Lieutenant Patrick O'Malley of the Chicago Police Department had worked murders for 7 years. He was thorough, cynical, and deeply suspicious of wealthy families who called fires accidents, when doors were locked from the wrong side. Tell me about the door, O'Malley said to Harriet Ashworth during his first interview, conducted in the sitting room of her sister's house, where she'd fled with her children after the fire. Harriet was 44 years old, still beautiful despite exhaustion and shock, dressed in borrowed clothes because everything she'd owned had burned. William was obsessed with safety, Harriet said, her voice hollow. After his brothers died, after the detective's report, he became convinced someone was trying to kill him. He had locks installed everywhere. The bedroom door could be locked from both sides, from inside to keep people out, or from outside to trap someone in. He always locked it from the inside when we went to bed. Always, always. Then how did it get locked from the outside? Silence. Harriet's hands twisted in her lap. I don't know. Who else had keys? The housekeeper, the cook, She stopped. Looked up at O'Malley with sudden recognition. You think someone locked him in deliberately. You think someone murdered him. O'Malley didn't answer directly. Mrs. Ashworth, I need you to tell me about your husband's half-sister, about Eleanor. What O'Malley discovered over the next 3 weeks of investigation painted an unsettling picture, not of guilt, but of absence. Eleanor Ashworth, now 13 years old, had become a ghost in her own family. She attended the funerals but spoke to no one. She lived in the Ashworth mansion with a rotating staff of servants and her guardian, Jonathan Blackwell, who visited daily but maintained his own residence downtown. She received tutors but attended no school. She had no friends her own age, no social connections, no presence in Chicago society. She was, by every account, extraordinarily intelligent. Her mathematics tutor described her as working at a collegiate level. Her literature instructor called her disturbingly well read for a child, with particular interest in texts about power, strategy, and human psychology. But she was also, everyone agreed, odd. "She watches people," said Martha Collins, who'd been hired as Eleanor's governess in September of 1898. "Not like a child watches curious, seeking approval. She watches like a scientist observing specimens. She calculates. It's unnerving." "Has she ever discussed her family's deaths?" O'Malley asked. Martha hesitated. "Once, after William's funeral. I tried to comfort her, told her it was all right to grieve. She looked at me and said, 'Why would I grieve for someone who wanted me dead?'" Did she elaborate? No. She just returned to her books. O'Malley interviewed every servant who'd worked in the Ashworth household over the past 18 months. He reviewed financial records, looking for unusual payments that might indicate hired killers. He examined the scene of William's death, the remains of Richard's horse accident, the medical records of every family member who'd died. He found exactly what Samuel Garrett had found: nothing concrete, nothing provable, just an impossible string of deaths and one child who seemed completely unmoved by them. But O'Malley also found something Garrett hadn't looked for: a pattern in the victims. Every person who died had either challenged Eleanor's inheritance legally, spoken publicly against her guardianship arrangement, or written letters suggesting she should be placed with other family members, every single one, no exceptions. Those who had accepted her position, who had stayed silent, who had made no moves to interfere with her trust. They all survived. It was, O'Malley realized, less like a pattern of murder and more like a pattern of consequences. Like someone maintaining a perimeter, eliminating threats not out of malice, but out of cold, systematic self-preservation. But 13. Old girls didn't think that way, didn't plan that way, didn't have access to the resources required to orchestrate multiple undetectable murders across different methods and locations. Which meant if Eleanor wasn't the killer, someone was killing on her behalf. O'Malley's investigation focused increasingly on Jonathan Blackwell. Blackwell was 60, 2 years old, Augustus's attorney for 3 decades, now the sole trustee of Eleanor's $14 million estate. He controlled everything: investments, properties, household expenses, educational costs. Eleanor couldn't spend a penny without his approval. The trust documents gave him absolute authority until Eleanor's 21st birthday, which meant Blackwell, more than anyone, had motive to protect Eleanor. Every death that reduced the number of potential challengers to her inheritance was a death that made his job easier, that reduced legal complications, that ensured the trust remained intact. "Mr. Blackwell," O'Malley said during their interview in Blackwell's law office, "I need to know your whereabouts on the night of William Ashworth's death." Blackwell didn't flinch. "At home, asleep, my wife can confirm. And the night Thomas Ashworth died, Detective, I was not lurking outside people's bedrooms giving them heart attacks." "What about Richard's riding accident?" "I don't work with horses, Detective. I work with contracts." O'Malley leaned forward. "Then help me understand something. 7 people connected to the Ashworth family are dead. All of them posed some threat to Eleanor's inheritance. None of the deaths are individually suspicious. But collectively, they're statistically impossible, And you're the one person who benefits from each death. I benefit. Blackwell's eyebrows rose. Detective, I'm paid a fixed annual fee to manage the trust. Whether there are 3 relatives or 30 makes no difference to my compensation. But it makes a difference to your workload, to the legal challenges you face. Are you accusing me of something? I'm asking you to explain the pattern. Blackwell was silent for a long moment. Then, Detective, you're looking at this wrong. You're looking for a mastermind orchestrating murders. You should be looking for what's actually happening, which is natural selection, Darwin in a family context. Augustus Ashworth's will created a survival pressure. Those who adapted, who accepted the new reality, survived. Those who fought it, who exhausted themselves in legal challenges and emotional rage, who made themselves sick with stress and resentment. They didn't. You're saying they killed themselves. I'm saying stress kills, Detective, especially when combined with poor health, excessive drinking, financial strain from legal fees, and the shock of disinheritance. Augustus's sons expected to be wealthy. Instead, they got $50,000 each and had to watch a child control millions. That kind of disappointment, that kind of rage, it eats people from inside. O'Malley stared at him. That's your explanation. They stressed themselves to death. Unless you have evidence of actual murder, Detective, yes, that's my explanation. O'Malley had no evidence. No witnesses to crimes, no forensic proof. Nothing except a statistical impossibility and a terrible feeling that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The investigation was formally closed in December of 1898. The deaths continued. By the year 1900, Eleanor Ashworth was 15 years old and controlled through her trust one of the largest shipping fortunes in the Midwest. She had no living parents, no siblings. Of Augustus's 3 sons, all were dead. Of their wives, all were dead. Of her extended family, 18 people had died since her father's death in 1897. The survivors had learned to stay silent, but silence doesn't mean acceptance. And in the spring of 1900, 3 of Eleanor's surviving cousins, daughters of Thomas Ashworth, made a decision that would prove fatal. They hired an attorney and filed a lawsuit challenging Jonathan Blackwell's management of the trust, alleging financial impropriety, claiming he was stealing from Eleanor's inheritance, demanding he be removed as trustee and replaced with a court-appointed guardian. The lawsuit was filed on April 3, 1900. Mary Ashworth, the eldest daughter at 26, died on April 27th. She fell down the stairs in her apartment building. Broken neck, instant death. The landlord testified she'd been carrying a basket of laundry, that the stairs were steep, that it was a tragic accident. Her sister, Grace Ashworth, withdrew from the lawsuit on May 2nd. The third sister, Sarah Ashworth, did not withdraw. Instead, she went public. She gave an interview to the Chicago Tribune that ran on May 10, 1900, with the headline, "Ashworth Heiress Linked to Family Deaths. Cousin Demands Investigation." The article detailed the pattern, listed the names, questioned the statistical probability, called for police to reopen their investigation. Sarah claimed her family was being systematically eliminated by someone with access to resources and legal protection, and that Eleanor Ashworth, while possibly not the direct killer, was at minimum aware of the murders and complicit in allowing them to continue. The article created a sensation. Other newspapers picked up the story. Suddenly, the deaths that had occurred quietly over 3 years were national news. Eleanor's name appeared in headlines across the country. The quiet, odd heiress became a figure of public fascination and fear. Sarah Ashworth died on June 3, 1900. Carbon monoxide poisoning. She'd been found in her bedroom, windows closed, A gas lamp left burning all night. The investigation ruled it suicide. A note was discovered beside her bed. I cannot continue. The weight of my family's deaths, the guilt I feel for speaking publicly, the knowledge that I've brought attention to Eleanor when all she wanted was peace. It's too much. I'm sorry. May God forgive me. The handwriting was confirmed as Sarah's. The note seemed genuine. Her sister Grace confirmed that Sarah had been deeply depressed since Mary's death, that she'd expressed regret about the lawsuit and the newspaper article. Case closed. Tragic suicide. But Detective O'Malley, now privately obsessed with the Ashworth deaths despite his closed investigation, noticed something about that suicide note. It contained phrases that Sarah had never used in any of her correspondence. The weight of my family's deaths was a construction Sarah wouldn't have written. Her letters showed she always wrote more directly, more emotionally. May God forgive me was strange because Sarah had been agnostic, something her family knew but the investigators apparently didn't. O'Malley couldn't prove the note was forged, but he knew in his bones it was. He went to see Eleanor Ashworth. The mansion on Prairie Avenue was imposing even by Chicago standards, a limestone monster with turrets and gargoyles, surrounded by iron fencing, its windows dark even in daylight. O'Malley had to argue with the housekeeper for 10 minutes before she finally allowed him inside, and another 20 minutes before Eleanor agreed to see him. She received him in the library, a room that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco, her father's scent, still lingering years after his death. Eleanor sat in a leather chair that dwarfed her 15-year-old frame, dressed in a simple black dress, her dark hair pulled back severely, her gray eyes fixed on O'Malley with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Detective," she said. Her voice was quiet but perfectly controlled. "I was told you had questions. Miss Ashworth, I want to talk to you about your cousin Sarah. She killed herself. Tragic, but not uncommon given the strain she'd been under. Did you read the newspaper article she gave?" "I did. And it was inaccurate, inflammatory, and defamatory. My attorney was preparing a lawsuit for libel when she died." O'Malley studied her. She showed no emotion, no grief for a cousin dead by suicide, no anger at the accusations, nothing. "Miss Ashworth, I'm going to be direct with you. Do you understand that people believe you're responsible for your family's deaths? I understand people need explanations for patterns they don't comprehend. I understand that it's easier to blame a wealthy orphan than to accept that sometimes terrible luck is simply terrible luck. You don't believe in luck." For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Interest, maybe. Or amusement. "What makes you say that?" "Because everything about you is controlled. Your schedule, your household, your education, your responses. People who believe in luck don't live like you do." She was silent for a moment. "Then, my father taught me that luck is what people call the outcome of preparation meeting opportunity. I prepare for everything, detective. That's not the same as causing things to happen." "Did you cause your family's deaths?" "No." "Do you know who did?" "I know that people who challenged my inheritance are dead. I know that people who accepted it are alive. I know that patterns exist whether or not we understand their causes. That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." She stood, indicating the conversation was over. "My family was cruel to me, detective. They treated my mother as inferior. They treated me as an obstacle. When my father died, they tried to steal what he left me. Not because they needed it. They each received $50,000, more than most people earn in a lifetime. But because they couldn't bear that a child, that the daughter of a housemaid, would control what they believed was rightfully theirs." She walked to the window, looked out at the manicured grounds. "I didn't kill them, but I don't mourn them either. Is that what you wanted to know? O'Malley felt a chill run down his spine. Miss Ashworth, if you know something. I know that my father chose me. I know that his choice was legal. I know that anyone who tries to undo his decision finds that the world has a way of correcting itself. She turned back to him. Is there anything else, detective? There wasn't, not that he could prove, not that he could articulate. Just a certainty that he was standing in the presence of either the most unlucky girl in America or the most dangerous. He left without another word. The deaths slowed after Sarah's suicide. For 2 years, the pattern seemed to break. Eleanor turned 17, 18, still in her trust, still controlled by Jonathan. Blackwell, still isolated in her mansion with her books and her tutors and her absolute control over every detail of her environment. Then, in 1902, Blackwell died. Heart attack, age 64, at his desk in his law office. His secretary found him in the morning, slumped over a contract he'd been reviewing. Dr. Mills signed the death certificate. Natural causes, expected for a man of his age and profession. But Blackwell's death was different because Blackwell's death changed the power structure completely. The trust documents specified that if Blackwell died or became incapacitated before Eleanor's 21st birthday, control would transfer to a court-appointed guardian subject to Eleanor's approval. And Eleanor, now 18 and legally able to petition the court, requested that she be granted early emancipation and immediate control of her inheritance. The legal battle took 6 months, but in December of 1902, Judge Harold Pemberton granted Eleanor's petition. At 18 years old, she became one of the wealthiest women in America with complete, unrestricted control over her fortune. The first thing she did was hire a new team of attorneys. The second was to begin divesting from the shipping business her father had built. The third was to move to New York. She left Chicago on January 4, 1903, and never returned, and in Chicago the deaths finally stopped. Eleanor Ashworth lived for another 47 years. She never married. She never had children. She transformed her inheritance into one of the era's most successful investment portfolios, focusing on real estate and emerging technologies. By the time of her death in 1949, at age 64, her fortune had grown to over $80 million. She died of natural causes in her Manhattan apartment, attended by nurses, her mind sharp until the end. In her will, she left specific instructions. Her entire fortune was to fund a trust dedicated to protecting orphan children, ensuring they received education, legal representation, and resources to defend their inheritances from predatory relatives who value wealth over kinship. The trust still exists today. It's helped thousands of children. But what about the deaths? What about the 23 people, by final count, who died in connection to Eleanor's inheritance? The official answer, the legal answer, the historical answer: tragic coincidence. A family destroyed by bad luck, poor health, and the stress of disinheritance. But there's another theory, one that circulated among investigators and true crime researchers for decades. In 1931, a dying man named Charles Wickham, former physician's assistant to Dr. Howard Mills, gave a deathbed confession to a Catholic priest. The priest, bound by confession confidentiality, never revealed the details publicly, but his private journals, discovered after his death in 1962, contained an entry dated March 14, 1931. Today, I heard a confession that will haunt me forever. A man dying of tuberculosis confessed to administering slow-acting poisons to multiple members of the Ashworth family between 1897 and 1900, at the direction and payment of persons he refused to name even as death approached. He described methods: substances that mimicked heart failure, infections introduced through contaminated medical equipment, psychological manipulation of unstable individuals toward suicide. He said he was paid $20,000 total. a fortune for a physician's assistant, and that the instructions came through intermediaries, never directly from the beneficiary. He expressed no remorse. Said they were people who wanted to steal from a child and that justice required their removal. When I asked if he meant Eleanor Ashworth ordered the deaths, he said, "I mean that sometimes God uses human hands to protect the innocent, Father, and sometimes the innocent are smarter than anyone gives them credit for." The journal entry was never verified. Wickham's identity was confirmed through church records, but he left no independent confession, no documentary evidence. The priest's account stands alone. Was it true? Did Eleanor, at 11 years old, somehow orchestrate a series of murders that continued for years? Did Jonathan Blackwell act on her behalf or his own? Was there a conspiracy involving multiple people? Or was the priest's account a fantasy, a dying man's delusion, a story that sounded better than the mundane truth that some families are simply cursed by coincidence? We'll never know for certain, but consider this. Eleanor Ashworth lived in an era where women, especially young women, were considered legally and intellectually inferior to men. She inherited wealth in a world designed to take it from her. She was surrounded by relatives who saw her as an obstacle, a mistake, something to be corrected. And yet, by the time she was 18, every single person who threatened her was dead, and she controlled one of America's great fortunes. Either she was the luckiest person in American history, or she was something far more terrifying, a child who understood, earlier than most adults ever do, that survival requires eliminating threats before they eliminate you. To this day, the case files remain in the Chicago Police Archives, Detective O'Malley's notes, filled with questions he never answered, the list of 20, 3 names, each with a death certificate, each with an explanation that seemed reasonable in isolation but impossible in aggregate, and somewhere in those files is a photograph taken in 1902 of Eleanor at age 17. She's standing in the library of her father's mansion, surrounded by books about law, medicine, chemistry, psychology. She's not smiling. She's looking directly at the camera with those calculating gray eyes. And if you study the photograph long enough, if you really look at her expression, you might see what O'Malley saw when he interviewed her. Not a victim, not a child, not even someone particularly sad about what happened to her family. Just someone who understood that the world was a dangerous place for the vulnerable, and who refused to be vulnerable ever again. The question isn't whether Eleanor was a monster. The question is whether any of us, in her situation, raised by a father who taught her to calculate and plan and protect what was hers, surrounded by people who wanted to take everything from her, whether any of us would have chosen differently, because that's the real horror of this case. Not that an 11-year-old girl might have been a cold-blooded killer, but that an 11-year-old girl might have been perfectly rational to become one. The story of Eleanor Ashworth remains one of the most statistically improbable cases in American legal history, not because of what happened, but because of what it reveals about inheritance, family, and the corrosive power of money to transform people into predators. 3 people died, a child inherited millions, and somewhere in that sequence of events, the line between victim and perpetrator dissolved until it became impossible to say which one Eleanor was. But questions remain, questions that disturb. The physician's assistant's confession, real or fantasy, the precise methods used in each death. If they were murders, how were they so perfectly disguised? Eleanor's emotional capacity, was she truly unmoved, or was her composure a survival mechanism? Perhaps these questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is the inheritance we all carry from this case. The knowledge that sometimes the most careful planning looks exactly like coincidence, and the difference between the two is functionally invisible. To this day, the Eleanor Ashworth Children's Trust operates out of offices in New York and Chicago. It has $8 billion endowment. It has helped more than 50,000 orphan children navigate inheritances, legal challenges, and predatory relatives. And on the wall of the main conference room hangs a portrait of Eleanor at age 60, looking as controlled and calculating as ever, with a brass plaque beneath it. Protection requires preparation. Justice requires courage. Survival requires doing what others won't. People still debate what she meant by that last line. If this journey through one of history's most unsettling inheritance mysteries resonated with you, if you find yourself lying awake tonight pondering the difference between self-preservation and murder, between inheritance and elimination, then this channel has more truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the uncomfortable questions about family, wealth, and the lengths people will go to protect what's theirs. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than entertainment, if it made you question whether you could really know what someone close to you might be capable of when everything is at stake. And in the comments, I want to know, if you'd been Eleanor Ashworth at 11 years old, orphaned, surrounded by relatives who wanted to steal your inheritance, who treated you as an obstacle to their own wealth, would you have fought back? Would you have protected yourself by any means necessary? Or would you have trusted the law to save you, even knowing that the law in that era rarely protected children, especially female children, especially children who inherited what adults believed they deserved? Until next time, remember, the most terrifying stories are the ones that force us to see ourselves clearly, to recognize that under the right pressures, with the right justifications, with enough at stake, any of us might cross lines we never thought we'd approach. And sometimes that recognition, that we're all capable of darkness when darkness becomes survival, is the inheritance none of us want to claim. But Eleanor Ashworth claimed it, and she lived with it for 47 years after the last death, and we'll never know if she slept peacefully or if she heard 23 voices in the darkness. That, perhaps, is the answer we deserve for not asking the right questions while she was alive to answer them.